Hi everyone, welcome to the CERIAS Security Seminar. So I am very happy to introduce this week's speaker. We have Professor Alessandro Acquisti from Carnegie Mellon University, CMU. So his research combines economics, behavioral research, data mining to investigate the role of privacy in digital society. He has been the recipient of a lot of awards, including PET Award for Outstanding Research in Privacy Enhancing Technology, IBM Best Academic Privacy Faculty Award, and a lot of awards. So I will not going to go through all of them. Uh, I think his research is really fascinating. That includes privacy, AI, uh, and a lot of interesting aspects. So I will give the floor to Professor Alessandro Acquisti. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you for inviting me for this introduction. It's a pleasure being here. I will be talking about a study we just finished, and I work on this with Eduardo Mustri, who is a PhD student at the Heinz College, and Idris Ajarid, who was a former student at the Heinz College, and now is a professor of Virginia Tech on behavior advertising, consumer welfare, and this is the kind of talk that I like to call the hourglass talk. What I mean is that I will start very broad. I will start with a big picture. Probably the first 10 minutes or so will be big picture, because I will try to introduce and frame not just this particular study that I will later present, but in general, the stream of work I've been trying to do in the past few years. What motivates it, and therefore what motivates also this particular study that I will be presenting. So that will be the thinner section of the talk. By thinner, I mean the part of the talk where I will go deeper, and I will spend most of the rest of the time presenting the study and the results. And then I will conclude going broad again, extrapolating and discussing what are the next open research questions. So to clarify, I am a privacy scholar, but I am an economist by training. So I've been working a lot on the economics of privacy. I have done lots of interdisciplinary work combining economics, behavior decision research, data mining. But in the last probably 10 years or so, I've gone mostly back to my roots as an economist, and I've been first reviewing the field of economics of privacy in the Journal of Economic Literature about 8 years ago or so with Curtis Taylor and Leah Wagman. And then much more recently for NBR, I wrote a somewhat critical piece of my own field of research. So a critique of the economics of privacy, in which I look back at 20 years of economics of privacy research, and I try to highlight the progress that this field has made, but also the issues that we have not resolved. In fact, I focus on the unintended consequences of the rapid growth of the economics of privacy as a field, and the problems that the rapid growth has created. I will give you immediately an example. When you think about behavior advertising, it has become common in the public debate around behavior advertising to see two different views. One view is that of many consumers and privacy advocates, which present behavior advertising as privacy invasive. And as a matter of fact, in surveys, many internet users report not appreciating online tracking, even when it is used to personalize ads. On the other hand, lobbyists for the large data tech firms, as well as some scholars from marketing, would counter that While behavior advertising may be seen as potentially invasive by some users, it is actually beneficial from an economic perspective. Essentially, what I see in the public debate around behavior advertising is this juxtaposition of a privacy concern on one side, but economic benefits for consumers on the other side. And you can see this, for instance, in the responses that the Federal Trade Commission has received after two recent initiatives. One was the groundbreaking Federal Trade Commission rulemaking on commercial surveillance, which received thousands and thousands of comments from scholars, from advocates, from industry, as well as the more recent request for guidance on digital advertising business, sorry, request for information on digital advertising business guidance, which also received comments, such as this one. This one is from the IAB, and the IAB refers to digital advertising as a source of direct and significant intrinsic monetary value to consumers. This claims that consumers directly benefit in economic terms from behavior advertising are actually quite common. Here I have another quote. This is from a online advertising executive, which talks about behavior targeting and presents it as an economic win-win. Some kind of technology which improves the economic welfare of all parties, including indeed the consumers, because they see ads and content which they are more interested in, advertisers, because they are, thanks to behavior advertising, they can allocate a scarce advertising budget only to consumers more likely to be interested in that, and publishers, because publishers are supposed to receive more revenues, higher revenues when they sell advertising space for targeted ads as opposed to behavior targeted ads as opposed to contextually targeted ads or random ads. Now, is this true? Are all these claims of economic benefits to stakeholders, other than, of course, the advertising intermediaries, the Google and the Facebooks of the world, is there empirical evidence, or is there, in fact, a sound theoretical economic support for these claims? Well, let's start from the theory. The theory behind the claims that online behavior advertising is an economic win-win can be described through the following figure. It's a two-sided market, which is economic lingo to refer to a market, especially platform, based on platforms where there are two different sides. This is a market for online advertising. On one end, consumers want to find merchants to buy from, and merchants want to find consumers to sell to. And merchants find consumers through publishers because they advertise on NewYorkTimes.com, on YouTube, on a TikTok video, on an Instagram influencer profile, and so on and so forth. In the middle, we have the data economy intermediaries. Like I said, the Google and the Facebook of the world. And because it is costly for consumers to find merchants and for merchants to find the right consumers, these intermediaries provide a service to both sides of the market by reducing search costs. They essentially, thanks to all the data tracking and the targeting, which this tracking makes possible, they decrease search costs for both consumers and merchants, and this means they create wealth. And this is represented in this graph by these little arrows going out. Essentially, this is wealth creation. This is the story that the online advertising industry and many marketing scholars tend to subscribe to. So all this data collection creates essentially more economic efficiency, reduces search costs, creates wealth. It is an economic win-win. Now, on theoretical grounds, this is actually a legitimate story. However, it just so happens that it is not the only possible story one can make. In fact, one could make an alternative, or at the very least, complementary story. And by complementary rather than alternative story, I mean that the second story that I am about to propose may actually be happening in parallel and simultaneously to the first story. What is the second story? In the second story, there are the same players, consumers, publishers, merchants, and the intermediaries. However, now, rather than focusing on the effect that the data intermediaries have in reducing search cost, we focus on the fact that they have in extracting economic surplus. What do I mean by this? I mean the fact that consumers have finite budget and attention. They cannot pay attention to all the ads presented to them all the time on all the myriad of channels that each of us daily engages in online, from blogs to Instagram to YouTube videos to online websites, online publishers, etc. Consumers have finite budget. They cannot buy all the products being advertised to them in a given day. And therefore, there is lots of competition among publishers for this this in non-infinite amount of consumer attention. And there is also very heavy competition between merchants for this finite budget, because nowadays a merchant who is trying to reach with some ad a visitor to the New York Times may be competing with 12 other merchants selling completely different products, who in real-time bidding are in the very same time trying to bid on and showing an ad to this particular visitor, because this visitor in the past has shown interest in shoes, in a vacation to Cancun, in enrolling in an online master degree, and so on and so forth. So all these different merchants at the same time are trying to gain the attention of this particular consumer. So you have lots of competition on the two sides of the market, but in the middle, what you have is an oligopoly. In that, although the online advertising market is quite vast and complex, and there are many intermediaries, that market is essentially dominated by very, very few players. The king makers are known to everyone, and therefore, if you use economic theory and you have a two-sided platform with lots of competition on the two sides, but oligopoly power in the middle, where would you expect most of the economic profit to go? Well, of course, in the middle. So under this alternative framing, it is the middlemen who get most of behavior advertising. Is not consumers, is not publisher, is not merchants at all. My point here is that if you want to use economic theory to present what is happening and whether entities other than Google, Facebook, Meta, Alphabet, and others, the extent to which behavior advertising is good for entities other than these ones, if you use economic theory, the answer is we don't know, because you can make very different stories. So what about the empirical evidence? So if you go back to this claim by David Nelson, what about the empirical evidence about advertisers, about publishers, and about consumers? Well, there has been quite a lot of research on advertisers. We know that advertisers see higher conversion rates when they behaviorally target ads when they don't. But the problem is that that's not the full story, because if all advertisers engage in those, use those tools to reach consumers, they see an increase in conversion rates, but if they all use these tools, essentially their market share stays the same. So it is conceivable that they end up in what we may call, using the language of the theory, some kind of a zero-sum game, a sort of a prisoner dilemma where all of them have to use these tools and no one ultimately benefit, even though seemingly there are higher conversion rates. Publishers, much less literature on that, much more controversial, because we know that publishers per impression get higher revenues when they sell behaviorally targeted impression than when they don't. But this is a per impression argument. When you look in the aggregate, you recognize that publishers, especially legacy publishers, are probably suffering from behaviorally targeted ads, in the sense that behaviorally targeted ads have increased competition for legacy publishers, because nowadays anyone can open up a profile on TikTok or an account on YouTube, can become a content creator, they make money precisely thanks to behavioral targeted advertising and erode revenues away from legacy publishers. Whether this is good or not for consumers, that's a other story, which I'm going to get to in a few slides. Finally, what do we do? What do we know about consumers? Very, very little. And this is the key of the rest of my talk. So here we are getting to the narrow part of the hourglass, where I focus on the study that I want to present. The motivation is clear. The value consumers derive from behavior advertising has been posited by many, but has not been accurately empirically demonstrated. Now, these may sound like strong, aggressive words. I don't believe they are. I believe that there is lots of empirical validation supporting my claim. What do I mean? Let me clarify that the economic value consumers can derive from behavior advertising, um, can be structured in essentially can be structured in two types, direct and indirect. Let me start with indirect. What is the indirect value? Essentially, it's a mediated value. The argument that the industry often makes is that uh, because behaviorally targeted ads are more valuable to merchants, merchants are willing to bid more for behaviorally targeted ads, which means if they bid higher amounts, it means that there is a higher per impression revenues for publishers, as I was mentioning earlier. And this higher per impression revenue translates into higher ability to provide content, more content, higher quality content. Now, this linkage, this causal linkage between behavioral ads and higher provision of free, especially free content and higher quality content is really difficult to disentangle for us economists because correlation is not causation. So typically what we try to do is to look for causal evidence by using what we call natural experiments or exogenous shocks. So we try to look for moments, events, instances when there was some change, exogenous change, such as a change in regulation or a change in industry using or not using privacy technologies. And then we try to analyze what impact this change had on the provision of content. And if you look at the literature that did this, and for those of you who are into empirical economics, I'm referring to studies that use what we call difference in difference models. If you look at the literature doing this, you find very conflicting evidence. You find evidence from Jassy et al. That will focus on the impact of GDPR on the provision of free apps in the app online mobile ecosystem, or you see Johnson et al., who more recently studied the impact of COPPA, actually specifically the fines that follow the FTC, the fines that the FTC imposed on Google for COPPA violations and the changes that Google made after the FTC stepped in. And they find that both GDPR and COPPA had negative effect on content creation, essentially after these events, which allegedly reduce the amount of data available in the market and therefore the trackability of consumers and therefore the extent to which consumers can be targeted with ads. They seem to find evidence of a decrease in the provision of mobile free apps or a decrease in the provision of free content for children on YouTube due to these COPPA events. But you also find opposite evidence. I co-author two papers and two studies, one with Vincent Lefreur and others, which was just accepted in Managerial Science just a few weeks ago, and another which is still under review with Christopher Chair and others. The study with Vincent is about the impact of GDPR on EU media, essentially online content providers, news and media websites. And we find no evidence that the GDPR decrease the content or the quality of content that use EU media websites were able to provide to their visitors compared to US websites, which were not as directly affected by GDPR. In the study with CRISPR, we find instead that Apple ATT, the application tracking transparency framework, which, as you know, a few years ago, 2021, changed quite dramatically the the trackability of mobile iOS users from essentially a opt-out system to essentially an opt-in system when it comes to privacy, did only add a negligible and only temporary negative effect on the provision of free apps on the Apple iOS app ecosystem, which suggests that, in fact, this indirect story of consumers benefiting through more and higher quality content because of behavior targeted ad is not so convincing, or at the very least, is not so clear. What about the direct effect? Well, the direct effect is the rest of my talk, because the direct effect is the following. The idea that consumers benefit from ads because they see from behaviorally targeted ads because they see more relevant product and service, which saves consumers time and money. Now, we do know from research that consumers do tend to click on behaviorally targeted ads more often than they click on random ads. And also behaviorally targeted ads are correlated with higher conversion rates in terms of actually selling products. That we know. There has been research on that. However, and this is the key, this only tells us, or mainly tells us, about search costs. Essentially, this evidence is telling us that these ads are reducing search costs for consumers, and the search costs are only one aspect of a consumer utility function. What I mean, and I hope I'm not using too arcane, too obscure economic lingo, when you look at the economic benefits of a consumer, the search costs, the time they spend searching and finding products, is only one element of the economic benefit they may accrue from engaging in a transaction after seeing an ad. There are other elements, very important, which have been essentially completely ignored in the literature. Issues such as vendor quality or product price. Essentially, what is the price that the consumer end up paying when if they buy a product which had been behaviorally targeted to them, as compared to the price they would pay if they had found a competitor product or a competitor vendor by searching. What is the quality of the vendor and the quality of the product they end up purchasing if they purchase through behavior targeted ads versus what they would have found if they search for the product. And there is no research on that. Notwithstanding the fact in the last few years that there have been a few more studies focusing on consumer search, welfare effect of consumer search and search ads. So what we need in order to tackle the direct economic benefits or lack of benefits from behaviorally targeted ads is a different approach, is what I call a holistic counterfactual empirical approach. And this is exactly what we try to do. So we did two experiments, study one, two online experiments, first study, and then a replication study conducted 1 year later, in which we compared objective metrics such as price of the product, the quality of the vendor, as well as subjective metrics, essentially our participants' subjective preferences for products across three experimental conditions. Essentially, we compare products which had been behaviorally targeted to the consumers via display online ads on news and media websites in the US. We compare that to products that the consumers could have found in the organic results of searches completed on Google. And we compare also against random products. And I will explain in a second what I mean by comparing. Essentially, each study followed the very same experimental design, where we first invited participants from using their own computers with their own browser, Chrome. We chose Chrome because it's the most common browser, at least in the United States, and it is also by default the most trackable and therefore the most likely to be associated with behaviorally targeted ads. We asked online participants, which we recruited on Prolific Academic, to come to our experimental platform and use their ads. And we asked them to visit a number of websites, which we had randomly selected out of a set of news and media websites that had a very, very high likelihood of having on their front page behaviorally targeted ads. And we instructed our participants to find an ad on the front page and then right click on the ad so that they could copy the URL of the ad. And then in the intermediate stage, they submitted this URL to us. A URL would look like this. The beginning of the URL would be essentially the ad network, but at the very end, there is a landing page, which is essentially where the consumer, where the participant in the experiment would have landed if they had clicked on the ad presented to them. And then we use script during the intermediate page to visit this landing page by following exactly the same link. For instance, in this case, we would end up on this landing page and we would collect the vendor information and the price that the consumer would have spent. Clearly, if you're asking yourself, how do we know that the information we find on the landing page will be the very same information that the participant would have found? How do we know that the price will be exactly the same? We know because we ran several pilots in which we tested very carefully that the information that we would capture through scripts by landing on that page would be identical to the information that would be seen by any participant in the experiment who had clicked on the link in the ad targeted to them. And then, in addition to that, we also use a script to search for competitor products for this for the product which had been targeted in the ad to the consumer, and we also collected information for the competitor product. And we focus on the organic search results and on the 10 organic search results shown on the first page on Google. And we randomly selected one of those 10 results. And then in the second stage, which happened about 2 weeks after the first stage, we invited back the participant and we presented the participant with 3 types of products which are being behaviorally targeted to them, the competitor products that we have found from organic search results, and then random products. By random, we refer to products which have been behaviorally targeted to other participants in the study, and which therefore, from the perspective of the quote-unquote target participant, were essentially random. Because the probability that 2 different participants would have exactly the same browsing history and exactly the same preferences is essentially close to 0. So in a nutshell, you can imagine this as a 3-condition within subject experiment. Because this is a relatively short presentation, I will focus, I will present the results only for 2 conditions. And as I told you, we collected both objective metrics and self-reported subjective metrics. But again, because this is a somewhat short presentation, I will mostly focus, when I talk about the results, mostly focus on objective metrics. I will be only mentioning the subjective metrics in one slide, because you will see that we found something very surprising from the subjective metrics. Okay, so this is the big picture, and now let's get to the results. The first study is this. As I said, we recruited participants on Prolific. They gave us 1,969 ad links, and we collected 3 times many data points because, like I said, we also searched for products and then we had the random products, etc. All participants were from the US, and you can see the distribution, the demographics here. They tend to skew educated, and some of them were had been using before ad blockers, not during the experiment, of course, because we were able to control for that, well, stop them from using ad blockers during the experiment. Otherwise, it would have been, not really valuable to have them as participants. We also can control for how many of them were using anti-tracking tools before the study. During the study, we basically stopped them from using them anti-tracking tools. But of course, if they were using anti-tracking tools before, they could have affected the results. And that's why we wanted to collect information on these to control econometrically and see whether prior usage of these tools would affect our results. These are the first results that I want to tell you about. These are vendor quality. These are objective results. What you see here are Better Business Bureau ratings. Essentially, what was the rating, the quality of the vendor? And as you know, the Better Business Bureau ranks merchants on letter grades. A class are the best. F are the kind of merchants who essentially don't send you the product or send you the product and it's broken and they don't want to replace it and so forth. You can see the results for ad and search. These are distribution. Essentially, the question is how often, if you search, you find A+ rated merchant versus a F rated merchant. And you can see that in search results, there is a prevalence of highly rated merchants, whereas in this 75% is significantly higher than this 57% in ads. Whereas in ads, there is a very high prevalence, relatively speaking, of F-rated merchants. Essentially, 1 out of 5 merchants appearing in the behaviorally targeted ads are essentially F-rated, the kind of merchants who don't send you the products and so on and so forth, compared to only 6% in search. We also collected site jabber data, which provides very consistent results. Second result I want to show with you for study 1, prices. We take the logs of prices because the products being advertised could be very expensive products such as laptops or very cheap products such as posters. So we take the log to kind of normalize to some extent price comparisons. And again, we compare ad and search and we can see that there is a significant, statistically significant and also economically significant difference. The products in ads are on average more expensive than their respective competitors than one could find in search results. Now, in addition, once a subset of our products were what we call identical products. What we mean by identical products, essentially, some products were unique. And only one vendor would sell them. So we can only find a competitor which sells something similar. But some other products were non-unique. So we can find other vendors which sell the very same identical product as the one in the ads, right? So for identical products, we repeated the price comparison and we ask how often one would find a cheaper price for the identical product among search than in ads. And these are the results. 52% of the times, one could find a cheaper identical product in ads related to in search. 32% of the times, one could find a cheaper product in ads rather than in search. And 15% of the times, or actually 16% of the time, the prices were identical. We estimate that the average price saving from conducting a product search is roughly 10%. Now, I told you that I wouldn't spend much time on the subjective results. The one that I want to highlight here is that relative to the ad condition. So here we have results for search and random, but these results are relative to what happens in the ad condition. So relative to that, we find the following. Search results are you see here, there is no statistically negative sign, but not statistically significant. The interpretation here is that products in search were no less relevant to our participants than products in ads. And this makes sense, right? Because the products in ads were, the products in search were competitor products of those in ads. So it makes sense that they are similarly or equally relevant to the product in ads. Instead, you see here, negative sign, statistically significant for the random products. And this again makes sense. It is telling us that when we present our participants with random products, and remember, random products in our context means a product which had been targeted to another participant, The participant to which a random product is being presented says, well, that's not very relevant to me. It's less relevant than a product advertised to me. And this again makes sense. So this is just a sanity check, but you will see why I'm presenting this result, because we discovered something extremely surprising in study 2. So keep in mind this result, because I'm going to go back to this in a few slides. So the results so far tell us that the products displayed in behaviorally targeted ads in our experiment, in our study 1, tended to be associated with higher prices and lower quality vendors, which is somewhat surprising. So we started asking ourselves why. And we realized that a possible explanation can be found in a paper dating back 40 years ago, over 40 years ago, by my own PhD advisor, Hal Varian, who decades before internet and e-commerce wrote a seminal piece titled A Model of Sales, in which he imagined a long-term equilibrium in which sellers alternate in what is called a mixed strategy equilibrium, alternate between pricing high to get higher profit margins for consumers who are not very well informed, and then pricing low to compete for informed consumers. So essentially, if you imagine that in the market, there are both informed consumers who are price sensitive because they are informed, they want to find a good price, and uninformed consumers, then you have an equilibrium like the one presented in Halverian study. And what if something is happening, something similar is happening online, where the informed consumers are those who search and the uninformed consumers are those who buy through ads? Well, we cannot find evidence of that directly because we didn't study the history of our consumers, but we can do something different. What we can do is to look at the distribution of vendors in search results and in ads. So here you see the distribution of vendors in search results. And you can see how all these vendors in search results are all large vendors. Amazon, of course, is the largest, but all the other companies, all the other websites are all major retailers. Essentially, it is nearly impossible for a small vendor to appear on the first page of organic Google search results. What about ads? Well, in ads, again, you have Amazon dominating ads, but interestingly, if you see some of these vendors, some of them are, again, large vendors, Nike, Walmart, Best Buy. But some others are completely unknown vendors. MyNameLecklace.com, lilycloth.com. So this suggests that essentially, because it's so hard for small vendors to reach consumers through organic search results, these vendors have to buy display ads as well as search ads, which we also study, but I cannot discuss today again because for time limitations. And these small vendors who buy display ads to behaviorally target consumers are a combination of good vendors and bad vendors. The vendors who price competitively and are high quality, but also the vendors who are low quality and price high. And so this is consistent with a Halverian story and could also be a long-term equilibrium. And this is the question we ask ourselves when we decided to repeat the study 1 year later, because we wanted to see 1 year later whether the results would change or would be the same, because we wanted to see whether we found just a fluke, whether we just got some odd results due to some idiosyncrasy at the time when we ran study 1, or whether in fact the results were consistent, and they were. So what I have here, study 1, the distribution of vendors, search and ad. Here you see study 2, distribution, search, ad is exactly the same 1 year later. The big difference is here. You see this group of vendors. Once again, we can see large vendors such as Amazon, and we can find very small vendors such as, I don't know, brillianthearth.com or nativeecos.com. What is interesting is that the proportion of small and large vendors is the same as in study 1, but the names, the identities of the small vendor changes, suggesting that there is this long-term equilibrium where there are small vendors that keep appearing in display ads, but they keep changing, right? What about Better Business Bureau ratings? This was study 1, and this is study 2. you can see results exactly replicated. So we have prevalence of high quality vendors in search results, and a worrisome percentage of F-rated vendors in ads. Log prices. This was study one. This is study two. Again, replicated. The same difference as being replicated 1 year later. Identical prices. So this was study one, and this was study two. Again, replicated. In essence, study two, 1 year later, replicated all of study one results. We also know that the study one results, both study one and study two results are robust to multiple specification, regressions, including all possible controls. We also conducted latent utility analysis to calculate welfare. We find welfare is higher in search than in ads. And here is the other surprising result I wanted to tell you about. Remember I told you that the behavior targeted ads were subjectively classified as more relevant by participants to them than random ads, than random products. And I told you, well, that makes sense, right? Because it makes sense that if products are have been behaviorally targeted, they should be more relevant than when they are random. But in study two, we added an additional question. We added that question because of the comments that some participants had left in the open-ended section of study one. Those comments led us to believe that sometimes people search for products on one day, and then some days later, they keep seeing ads for those products, a phenomenon that I believe all of us have experienced. So in study two, we decided to control for participants who claim to have searched for products. And therefore, we look at whether the self-reported higher relevance of behavior targeted ads remain higher than random products after controlling for that. And the answer is no. Essentially, after we control for prior searchers, the higher relevance of the behavior targeted ads disappears. This tells us that the behavior targeted ads are not necessarily informing consumers about new products per se, but they're probably informing consumers about new vendors or perhaps new brands. Now, before I wrap up and get into the bigger picture again, I should note some limitations. We focus on display ads, Google search results, Chrome browser users, and therefore we cannot really claim we don't know how these results would apply to other contexts like Facebook ads or Amazon ads. Nevertheless, what we found was that search results are dominated by large vendors, which creates a barrier to entry for small vendors who therefore have to use behaviorally targeted ads, which in that regard function to some extent as a useful tool to inform consumers about vendors that perhaps they would not have otherwise found. On the other hand, these behavior targeted ads are also associated with higher prices and lower quality vendors. And like I said, the impact on search costs, whether they really meaningfully reduce search costs, that's a little unclear. Which leads me to the final part. I promise you that I will close big again, opening broad, going broad again, because I started by talking about not just a study, but a series of research questions, such as is it true that behavior advertising may be privacy invasive but good for consumer welfare? And our results suggest that not so clear. It's not so obvious that they're good for consumer welfare. And then leads me to the other quote I used earlier, the quote from David Nelson. So is it true that behavior advertising is an economic win-win? Again, I'm not so sure. And much of my research in the last few years, and I hope in my future years, focuses on this. Essentially, in the public debate around privacy, you often see privacy defended for moral and ethical reasons, which are super important. But then you see industry saying, well, yeah, but it's good. Data collection tracking is good for the economy. I'm not so sure whether that is always true from an economic perspective, or rather, let me put it this way. I want to carefully scrutinize how the economic value that we do extract from data, from consumer data, is ultimately allocated to different stakeholders. And this is what I'm trying to study with my current and my future research. If you're interested in that research, feel free to send me an email, go on SSRN and check my profile or go to my website. And thank you very much for inviting me for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Alessandro. Thank you for the really interesting results. So we have one question from Andrew. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. So the question is, how close were the studies to the holidays? Seems like ad buying patterns swing widely based on how close the date is December 25.
Yeah, good question. They were not close to the holidays. We didn't. Indeed, we wanted to avoid a holiday season because it could have, bias in one way or another, the results. And we intentionally conducted the studies pretty much 1 year later in order to find kind of if there were seasonal effects to find the same seasonal effect.
Okay, any more questions, folks? So I have one question. So like there are a lot of folks who use ad blockers or those sort of extra add-ons. In such cases, the ads that are come on like by controlled by those sort of third-party software. So do you have any like feedback on that, how that can affect the whole ecosystem?
So sorry, are you referring to the ad blocking specifically?
Yeah. So like
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a great question. It's an interesting dynamics because it seems like there is a cat and mouse game going on, right? Where the more people use ad blockers, the more users who don't use ad blockers get inundated with ads. And you see it, for instance, on YouTube, right? YouTube many years ago started with no ads. Then they would have one ad every 10 videos, then one ad every 5 videos, then one ad every video. Then they started playing with multiple ads per videos. And there is this paradoxical effect where the more the users who don't use ad blockers are inundated with ads, the more users want to start using ad blockers. Google clearly is aware that it is happening, and that's why if you follow the online ad blocking ecosystem, one of the reasons for behind the switch from Manifest v2 to Manifest v3 on Chrome was specifically to make it much harder for the blockers to do their job, right? And you have been seeing in the news recently how uBlock Origin has been apparently, the blocker has been finally blocked by Chrome, allegedly. So it is a cat and mouse game. Lots is at stake here. I am extremely curious. I don't make any prediction whatsoever. I am extremely curious personally to know how these dynamics will eventually pan out, because Google is actually taking, I will suppose, a pretty big risk in what they're doing, because they're basically counting on the fact that Chrome is the dominant browser and Google has a dominant position in the advertising market to basically impose on a large portion of internet users limitations on ad blocking. They're basically saying, okay, if you use Chrome, you no longer can block everything you want because ad blockers under Manifest v3 will be significantly limited in what they can block. Well, that's a big bet, right? Because what if this is going to push lots of Chrome users to alternatives which do exist in the marketplace, from Firefox to Brave to many other browsers that nowadays exist? It's a big bet that Google is making. I am personally absolutely fascinating to see how this will pan out.
Yeah, thank you. That's really insightful. So we have one more question from Sid. So Sid asks, do you think we will soon have a definite answer about whether tracking for behavioral ads is a net win or loss for the consumers, considering both privacy or economic values?
Could you please repeat the question? I
Yeah,
apologize.
sure. So he asked, do you think we will soon have a definite answer about whether tracking for behavioral ads is a net win or loss for consumers, considering both privacy and economic values?
Well, yes and no. What I mean is the following. if you believe my result, let's say that my results have general applicability, okay, which they may not, but let's suppose it, that they have general applicability. Then, if you trusted my result, if I were to trust my own results, and if the results were generally applicable, then I would conclude that we already have the answer, right? Because essentially we know that these ads are privacy invasive, and we debunked the claim that they are economically beneficial, because we just demonstrated that no, they are not economically beneficial because they correlate with higher prices and lower quality vendors, and because their impact on reducing search costs is quite minimal. So that's a possible story I could make. However, there are lots of nuances, because one could counter that, well, you only did a study on Chrome, on Google search results, and perhaps the reduction in search costs is so significant that actually people prefer to spend a little bit more if they have to, if that allows them to spend less time searching. So things get very nuanced, right? So in a way, that's why I answer yes and no. Because if you want, you can use my result to say, we demonstrated behavioral targeted ads are both privacy invasive and economically they don't bring much benefit. Or you could look at it through more nuanced lenses. I don't know whether we can, ultimately it's difficult to come up with a conclusive objective number, because there are so many factors, so many variables, and so many ways to slice any type of result. What I do feel comfortable saying is that when industry claims, as they did in response to the FTC rulemaking on commercial surveillance, behavioral ads have significant intrinsic monetary value to consumers, I feel comfortable saying maybe, maybe not. Essentially, I'm feel comfortable saying that the empirical evidence that statement is true is extremely limited, which is not identical as saying that there is a strong evidence that the claims are false, but it still points out that the evidence that the claims are true is pretty weak. And then I'll let you decide.
Yeah, thank you, Alessandro, for the talk.
Hey, MTS, I see that Jimmy has his hand raised. So, Jimmy, I'm going to allow your microphone if you have a question or not.
Yeah, that should be good. Thank you. Thank you. Jimmy, can you ask your question?
Oh, maybe.
Jimmy Rock is muted, so maybe I don't know whether he's trying to unmute.
Okay, maybe he's not there, or maybe he accidentally hit that. But
yeah, he has his hands up, but I think he's muted, it seems.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I think thank you, Alessandro, for the really interesting talk. I don't see any more questions. It was really yeah, Jimmy says sorry. Yeah, it's fine, it's fine. So it was really interesting to see these results. Actually, we don't think about in that way, but it's really exciting to see this sort of, because yeah, it's kind of intrinsic to seem that it has a lot of value, this sort of ads, but it's good to see that there are still different ways to that. So yeah, let's thank our speaker. I want to add one more thing. For next week's talk, it will be in person in Stewart Center. So folks, please try to attend. In person, it will be really nice. So thank you, Alessandro.
My pleasure. Thank you.